This week in Nigerian history takes us 60 years back to 1966, where January 15, the very, very first coup in Nigeria occurred. This was a significant blow to the country, not, ol- not only as it heralded the start of, or the thinking that, at any point in which the military felt things were not going their way or things were not going the way they saw the opportunity, they could step in and, take over power. And of course, set the country back a few years by having to restart the democratic processes again. But more significantly, the coup of 1966, the January 15 coup. Oh yeah, there was a second one. There was a backlash to this January 15 in July. But the January coup of January 15, 1966 also exacerbated the ethnic tensions and regional biases that continue to be a staple of modern day Nigeria. But yes, let's run through a quick background of the events that led to the January 15 coup. Now, after the British left and Nigeria continued as a democracy, and part of this required, as many people are aware, the involvement of the Senate as well as the presidency in running the country. However, one of the issues that remained was basically the imbalance of power across the three regions that made up Nigeria. You had the northern region represented by the MPC, you had the NCNC and the AG representing the east and the west respectively. Now, one of the issues that made that made basically the coup and reverse event leading up to it be a formality rather than an aberration was majorly because of the perception that there was an imbalance in terms of the power held by the three regions, the north, the east, and the west. And this was likely because the population of the north, particularly as it was represented in the Senate and the House of Rep, superseded the east and the west. So therefore, in just a pure democratic way, in a pure majority, there was nothing that could be passed against their own say-so, basically, because they were just more in the house, So anytime any vote was counted, they were more. And so, or if it was not to their favor, it was not going to happen. And this was even exacerbated again. It was made worse because in 1964, Awolowo, that's Obafemi Awolowo, who was the premier of the Western region and basically the head of the AG, was deposed and incarcerated, corruption charges and various other. Of course, people felt those charges were nebulous, but he was deposed and replaced via the 1964 regional elections when Samuel Akintola came to power. Akintola was also, while he was Yoruba and he was in the West, basically, people looked at him as a puppet, basically, for the North. They felt that the North was in any ways controlling him. And so it was not necessarily a balm to the inflamed tensions that was already happening. And because many people felt that even the election of Akintola was also again corrupt and, it was manipulated, basically. If you think of how elections again today are usually victimed as being flawed. At that time also, the perception of those elections being flawed led to people led to protest and violence within the West. These protests, particularly in Ibadan, led to, there were arsons, there were murders, there were various sort of activities that, even if you understand why people felt that way, of course, you could see how the picture it was painting and how the government was going to react, which they did. They sent in the battalions, the armies, to quell these protests. And whilst they were able to do it, again, it's further again caused issues because many people felt the army in Ibadan at that time was likely made up of soldiers who were northern in origin. And so many people felt that these soldiers were politically activated and were biased and pro the northern political parties. Around this time, many of these young soldiers in the army, some of whom were college educated, began to come up with plans because they already not just the issues and the instability in the West after those protests, but also the general feeling that the country, a lot of the government officials and politicians, that these people were corrupt. A lot of people had that perception of them, particularly seeing as they were being ostentatious about the words they had gotten. That is those politicians. And so around that time, many of those young soldiers, God, see me, many of those young soldiers began to come up with a plan, and the idea was basically was what would eventually lead to the first coup. So these coup plotters, they were made up of, whilst there's probably there are many people who think there are five in numbers. The general accepted number of the initial of the at least the major coup plotters were actually nine, of whom Emmanuel Ifea Juna was widely regarded as the brains of the activity, despite Kaduna Zeogo being a figurehead in terms of like the public face of the coup. Now, one thing to know again is at that time, the Prime Minister of Nigeria was not like now in which we have a federal democracy. Then it was different basically. The power largely lay with the Prime Minister, and the presidency was basically a ceremonial position. The Prime Minister then was Tafawa Balewa, right? Whereas the president, Tafawa Balewa from the north, while the president was Nnamdi Azikiwe, who was from the east. Now, the first thing is, as we said, the presidency was largely a ceremonial position, which came into play because there were certain orders Azikiwe gave, but usually were ignored. Others separate. The other thing was that whereas the Prime Minister had the power, Tafawa Balewa, there was issues because people even also saw Tafawa Balewa himself as a puppet of the Sojourner of Sokoto, the Northern Premier, Ahmadu Bello. So it was seeming that, okay, there was somebody who had greater power in the country, which is Ahmadu Bello, who was never in the federal government in terms of like being the Prime Minister or the President. And then he had somebody else who again was also from the North, Tafawa Balewa. And so it seemed like, and then by the time you also combine that with the overwhelmed the majority of in terms of the Senate and the House being held by the northern positions, and it just felt like the power largely lay with the North. Now, while this was an issue, and of course it was leading to a lot of bias in terms of how people perceive various regions within the regional differences, this was not necessarily one of the issues that was raised by the coup plotters. Instead, like I said, it was corruption and various other things like that. However, when the coup then came to be, basically the quick rundown for how the coup came to be was simply there was Nigeria had three major regional capitals. You had the northern capital of Kaduna. You had the western capital where that was Ibadan basically, and they also had the federal one of Lagos. Now, the eastern capital was ruled by the eastern premier, basically, and that was Michael Opara. But when the coup plotters struck, what they did was basically they attacked the northern capital, and that was led by the coup plotter was led by Kaduna Zeogo, who, again, like I said, was the major public face. Basically, I'll give a quick rundown of how it happened. Before the coup, before the January 15th day, he had already taken permission because he was one of the leading commanders in the north, and he had taken permission from his superior, a particular Keshi. And what he was doing was basically training his soldiers. He was telling them that he was training them in new military techniques. His own superior had given him permission that, okay, yeah, that's cool, well done. Only for them to find out later on that, oh, this thing was being ordered, that they had a coup, like there was a plan all along. But by that time, it was already too late. Kaduna told his soldiers, and obviously, many of them agreed with him, even though there are rumors that some of them were not, but obviously, they agreed with him. They struck. They killed Ahmadu Bello, the Sojourner of Sokoto. They killed, I think they killed his wife. They also killed many of his staff members, about 4 of them. And then they declared a military He declared martial law in the north, basically. For the western region, um, Emmanuel Ifejuna was basically the head of it, although he assigned Ibadan to Captain Nwobosi, another of the coup plotters. Now, Emmanuel Ifejuna, what he did was, before the day of that's January 15th, there was a wedding. This wedding was led by Emmanuel Ifejuna's superior, Mai Malari. Now, what Mai Malari did, he invited many politicians, soldiers, for the wedding. Things run in the country. Weddings, people come, everybody comes to chill and celebrate. But because of the insecurity again, people were feeling, Lagos could be tense and everything. But Emmanuel Ifejuna said, "Don't worry, I'll bring my soldiers. We'll ensure there's peace." And everybody was like, "Oh, that's cool. We are fine with that." Not knowing that he had his own plan again. You see, be careful when people tell you they will help you. Anyways, you're soldier when you're in power. So, on the day of instead of bringing the soldiers, of course, they maintained peace, but obviously they had a different intention. And so on the day of the coup, they struck. Now, the major thing that was supposed to happen was they're supposed to attack many of, including Aguiyi Ironsi, who was also one of the, was the most senior soldier in the country at that time. And was one of the people listed on their hit list, basically. But they couldn't get to him. Instead, they were able to basically attack a lot of other people within the region, within the Lagos party, including Mai Malari, who was the superior of, again, the person who was hosting where himself got killed. Apart from him, now to go to the west, and we'll come back to Lagos one again later, but to the western one, the one that happened in Ibadan, which was led by Captain Nwobosi, he was able to get to Ladoke, to Samuel Akitola, killed him. Also, they attacked Tafawa Balewa, who was also attacked in Lagos, actually. He was also killed. Basically, by the end of the coup plans, they had already killed about 22 people. But majorly, as I said, Aguiyi Ironsi in Lagos escaped. How did he escape? Got a call from somebody, a particular soldier, and that person basically warned him of what was going on, even though that soldier was eventually killed. But Aguiyi Ironsi was able to then gather and bring together loyalists, people who were in support of him, and then they were able to, stop the coup plotters. Emmanuel Ifejuna, who was leading the war for Lagos, escaped and ran away, left the country, whereas all the other coup plotters were arrested. Now, the northern one, which happened first, early in the morning, they had already, by the time they had finished their own coup, Eziogu was waiting that, he was expecting that, because the plan was that when the Lagos guys take on their own operations, they will take over the National Broadcasting Corporation and they will broadcast it to the country that, the new changing regime and various things like that. But when he didn't hear anything, and I think the only thing he was hearing was it was being announced on BBC that, things were happening in the country. That's when he had already declared martial law. But once they started realizing, the loyalists were fighting back and they were taking over places, of course, people started panicking, and then the country, Aguiyi Ironsi was able to gather the enough forces to put down all the coup plotters, even the ones in the north, and then arrest them and put them in prison. At the end of the day, 22 people were killed. Only one of them, Negbe, Igbo, and then the other ones, including the Sadona Shokoto Amadu Bello, Tafawa Balewa, Akintola, the premier of the West, they were done being killed. Oh, I even missed this out. Before this coup happened, actually, Azikwe, the president at that time, had actually traveled and had given power to the head of the Senate at that time, Nwafọ Orizu. So he has given power to the basically acting president until he got back. Azikwe went on a cruise to the Caribbean, and so he had given power to them. Now, the issue was that Nwafọ Orizu himself was also not armed. Now, basically, optics. Whilst this coup was basically designed and set to, address corruption and various things like that, but optically, a lot of the people that were killed were not Igbo. In fact, out of 22 people that were killed, only one of them was Igbo. The others were all of either Yoruba or Northern in origin. But the people that were not killed and that were significant people in the government at that time, many of them were Igbo. The Senate president, Nwafọ Orizu, the person who actually quelled the coup and stopped it, Aguiyi himself, was Igbo. The premier of the East, Michael Okpara, was Igbo. So many people felt that, you know what, why is it like, you say you're trying to do a coup to stop, power and, make everything better in the country and everything. But why is it that most of the people that were killed happen to be your people? Why is it that most of the people who planned the coup were from a region, and most of the people who escaped were also from that region, but most of the people that got killed were from a different region? Make it make sense. That was basically the feeling. Now, whether or not there was tribalistic sentiment at play, I'm not sure I believe there was. But one can see the optics of how it came to be seen. But the major repercussion of this was just basically that perception of this being more or less a regional or a tribal thing was one that would take hold and become difficult to root out, and led to basically set the stage for the future event that would happen, particularly the retaliatory coup that happened 6 months later, as well as how that one itself continued to fuel further tribalistic sentiments, and up to this very day, because each of those events built upon each other up to this very day. The end result basically of the January 15 coup, January 15, was just that beyond this tribalistic hate that has continued to be a problem, and thankfully reduce. I hope I'm saying it's reducing, but well, it's reducing to an extent, but it's still there. But beyond that was basically there was an impact to the fledgling democracy of Nigeria at this particular day, when the country, barely 6 years old, it was still finding its foot, in the international stage as well as at home. The democratic process was cut short, and then it, even in that period, there was even questions about why did he even just hand power to the to the military? Why not just reform a new government? But regardless, the democratic process was cut short. This basically also, apart from the tribalistic hate again, this democratic process that was cut short is not even bad in itself. It was just basically that it gave the sentiment and the mentality to future soldiers that when things don't go your way, when the country is like, when things like this are happening, is not a solution. Basically, is that you can take on the power by yourself. You can have a coup, and that in itself led to future problems. As we had, I think, about 9 coups, and of course, this set the stage. This was a precedent for it. Now, fast forward from 1966 to 17 years. I got it. 70 years to January 17, 1983. Now, the second event on today's list is Ghana must go. Ghana must go. If you're like me, who grew up in Nigeria, the name, whenever you hear Ghana must go, of course, there's just one image that comes to your mind. That checkered bag, that plastic checkered bag, it's something we all carry very when we were young, going to school, carrying loads everywhere. Now the question is, well, how did his name come to be? And we trace it back to this day, January 17, 1983, when the president of Nigeria, Alhaji Shehu Shagari, issued an executive order that day on January 17 that every undocumented, oh God, DACA, every illegal immigrant that come into the country had to leave within 2 weeks. Deadline being January 31st, 1983. This was a shock. Well, not necessarily like a shock in the immediacy of the timeline given, but in itself, it was the conclusion of the various sentiments that had already been at play or within the public domain at that time. A lot of the immigrants which happened to live in Nigeria at that time happened to be Ghanaian, and so that day was basically equivalent to telling the Ghanaians, rather than just the immigrant, to get out of the country. Now, the events that led to that day. In 1960, Nigeria had struck oil during around 1959, but then by 1960, the oil started going up in terms of price, and by 1970s, there was a oil boom globally. Nigeria was pumping out a lot of oil, and oil was, the prices of oil soared very much in the 1970s, and so we were very, very, we're doing well. And earlier in one of the events, we talked about the Naira even coming at that time, and so by the time the Naira came out at that time and became our official currency, it was Naira to dollar was about, I think, 2 Naira to a particular dollar, to $1. And so we're really doing well. The country was doing well, prosperous and everything. Contrary, by that time, Ghana was going through a tough times. They had their own, rather than oil, their own major national resource at that time was cocoa. And whereas the cocoa had been very good earlier, by the 1960s, it had gone down. Prices had dropped. They were also in the military. There was other military government by that time also. And hey, we're not the only one. And because of that, many Ghanaians had actually left the country. They had gone to find better place because the economy was bad. Things were very expensive there. Now, one thing before we even go further, by the time things were bad in Ghana, one of the things they did was chase out Nigerians. Nigerians then that were living in Ghana were actually very prosperous. They had a way of finding food. They had everything. I don't like to add to stereotypes and all, but people had that stereotype that yes, Nigerians, we know how to, we know how to survive. Put us anywhere. We know how to, make do and be good and find our ways and, find our fate. And that was basically how it was in Ghana too. People found a way so Nigerians to be prosperous. You could do anything, And so they were very rich. And the Ghanaians that were around them didn't like that. And so the sentiment, of course, came up and eventually the anti-immigrant sentiment prevailed and they basically issued a order that chased out many Nigerians. And the Nigerians left, of course, all you do. But when the Ghanaians also now came here, after the oil boom in 1970s and the Ghanaians that come and they started settling and finding themselves. By the 1980s, early 1980s, the oil price started to drop. Why? Because many countries like the United States, they also struck oil within their own country and started, finding oil within their own places. Supply started to outstrip demand for oil. So again, competition and price drop. Now, because of that in Nigeria, there were a lot of issues. The economy was, of course, and it continues to remain the same, was largely reliant on oil. And since when oil prices started to drop, the cost started to rise because this economy started to go down. The food prices, transport prices, basically cost of living, everything continued to rise. And people started to become unhappy. And when people start to become unhappy like that in that particular time, what do they first turn to? It's the same thing people always do, even today. They turn to the AIDS in their hearts. They turn to AIDS in their hearts, basically, which is and it's usually force people to be turned against are the people who are not like them. They're not like us. The people who are not like them, that's the immigrants. And so they were you blame them for taking your jobs, blame them for bringing crime, blame them for every single thing. And so that was the thing at that particular time. And soon it spread into the politics. Politicians started to speak about it. You start referring to them rather than just your neighbors or friends or people on the road. You start calling them aliens, migrants for them, aliens, people like that. It starts to spread into manifestos. And soon enough, it becomes a major and national thing, a national discussion or a national topic. And eventually, at the upper echelons of the government, discussions that began to be held on this. And all this boiled down to the 1983 January 17 executive order issued by Shagari that they should leave. Now, of course, many people were the other who have been worried about what they should do next and where they should go. And some people, rightfully and understandably, would be willing to hide and stay, figure out ways to blend in and not run back to Ghana at that time, which was again under military rule. And so they were worried about that place even being worse than Nigeria. But things changed once people started hearing rumors that the government had given orders to Nigerians, to the locals, that you can attack any Ghanaian. Basically, do it like the purge. Anybody that you see that is Ghanaian within these 2 weeks, that if they not left at these 2 weeks, you can attack them. So that was not nice, of course, but it's basically led to that panic and that need and the understandable decision by many Ghanaians to eventually to leave. And so by January 31st, many Ghanaians already packed their bags. And of course, what did they pack it in? The particular checker and plastic bags that we come to now call Ghana Must Goes. They packed their Ghana Must Goes and started going. And so many of them got to the borders. The borders were tight, man. They were really, really the places was really crammed up. Millions of people, literally millions of people were there. And so there was almost stampede. Some people died because there was no space. Everybody was there. And what was no made it worse was that the borders were closed. Not Nigerian borders, but the Ghanaians, when they realized a lot of people were coming back, the military governor, I think it was General, he basically closed the border there. Part of his own reason was that he does not want people to come in and come out. They could use the opportunity there could be an opportunity by certain people to, plot a coup against him. So he closed his own border. And after he closed his own border, he closed the border with Togo, because the Ghanaian border was beside Togo. And he closed it with Togo. Togo understandably realized we are letting people into our country, but the exit to Ghana is closed. Of course, these people will not have anywhere to go but in my own country. So let's close our own entry too. Close it. And their own entry was with Benin. So they closed their own with Benin. So the Benin own border became very, very, very blood, because they started regulating their own border with Lagos, because the Benin own border with Lagos was basically the entry into Benin. And so these people now didn't really have money anywhere to go. So it was really, really tight. Some other people tried to go through Shaki to get to the Seme border, various other places. But everywhere was very tight. And of course, international communities were not happy. They didn't like the image that was being portrayed by Nigeria. And so, although to be fair, hey, we see many countries, even the big ones, do it today. So, hey. But at that time, there was aid that was sent. Many people were airlifted. Tents and provisions were provided to help people, especially people who were stuck at the border. Eventually, the Ghanaian president, really, the head of state, lifted up the restrictions at the border, and they opened up their border. People came in. They also sent ships to Cotonou to pick people, although many people still fell into the sea because there were just so many people. To this day, neither of the countries, all the countries that were involved, they have not apologized to each other. Nigeria has not apologized for that event. To be fair, and again, as I mentioned, the Ghanaians that did it initially in 1969, and also I think one in 1950s, where they also expelled Nigerians. And I think even after 1983, there was also another expulsion when Buhari came to power in 1984. And this is when it was even documented migrants were chased out, by 700,000 of them being Ghanaians. But thankfully, to this, even if none of countries involved have apologized, there's more comfort in the fact that relations between neighboring countries here in Africa, particularly across this Western Africa, are much more cordial and much more pleasurable. It's one thing to have as a black person, and also as an African, to be worried about, your perception by various other countries abroad and how you are being treated there. But it's another to also have these issues with your neighbors. As many of us know, if you have neighbors at all, you don't want to be having issues with them, because at the end of the day, hey, it's your immediate community, right? You want to feel safe there. You want to feel welcome there. You want to be able to talk to each other and assist each other when needs be. You want to be able to say, oh, hi, I'm from Nigeria. And somebody asks you, hey, Kwame from Ghana is in Africa too now, don't you know it? Anyways, but really, it's a good thing that right now the major issues that we have among Africans, particularly with our Ghanaian brothers and sisters, that's whether whose jollof rice is better, basically, and whose football team is better, because we both know the answer to those questions, obviously, but at least, at the very least, those are issues that cannot lead to, that hopefully do not lead to serious repercussions or have long-lasting damage on people's lives. Anyways, I I think that's likely it for this week in Nigeria. I wish you a wonderful week, and yeah, Nigeria's jollof is better. Have a wonderful week, everybody.